Hi, Haldora. I've just been nodding and pretending that I understand anything you just said. So sorry. I actually I'm afraid I have this theory that I don't really believe the Icelandic language exists, because when I came to Iceland, everyone spoke such perfect English that I was just like, is this some kind of weird game that Icelandic people play where they pretend they have a separate language? But no, I accept that you are a self-determining country. I'm so excited to talk to you guys, because when I came to Iceland, I was invited by Haldora. I was so struck both by how brilliantly the Pirate Party is arguing for change on this policy and how needed that change is in Iceland. So I want to talk to you a little bit about why I believe fighting to decriminalize and eventually legalize drugs in many cases is one of the most urgent moral issues of our time, and why I hope that you will continue to be part of this really important fight, and why I think Haldora is doing amazing work on this. So for me, this is a very personal question. One of my earliest memories is of trying to wake up one of my relatives and not being able to. And I was too young to understand why then. But as I got older, I realized that we had an addiction in my family. Several members of my family, we still do. And like a lot of people in that position, and there's going to be a lot of people watching in that position, it was a real mixture of feelings. Part of me was very angry with them and had that, although I never supported the war on drugs, I did have a kind of angry drug war voice in my head saying, why doesn't someone just stop you? But there was another part of me that could see, well, that just wasn't working. People were angry with them and it wasn't solving the problem at all. In fact, it seemed to be making it worse. So to really try to understand this, having grappled with it in my family for so long, for my book, Chasing the Scream, I can't say the name in Icelandic, but I'll get Haldor to do it. I ended up going on this really big journey all over the world. I ended up traveling over 30,000 miles. I wanted to go to the places that had very different approaches to drugs and the war on drugs, from the places that are harshest in the world, like Vietnam, where they make people with addiction problems go out in forced labor camps, or in Arizona, where they make people who've got addiction problems go out on chain gangs where they're humiliated and the public mock them, to places that have the most compassionate policies in the world, like Portugal and Switzerland, who we're going to come to in a minute. And I learned just a huge amount about this question. And one of the most shocking to me was that I had profoundly misunderstood what addiction itself is. I'd actually misunderstood what I thought I had seen in front of me all my life. So when I started doing the research for Chasing the Scream, God, 9 years ago now, if you had said to me, let's say what causes heroin addiction, because that's something that was close to me, I would have looked at you like you were an idiot. And I would have said, well, obviously, heroin causes heroin addiction, right? We've been told a story for 100 years that's really driven the global approach to drugs, and particularly in Scandinavia and Iceland. This story we have about what addiction is. So I'm speaking to you from London. We think if I kidnapped the next 20 people to walk past my house, and like a villain in a horror movie, I injected them all with heroin every day for a month, at the end of that month, they'd all be heroin addicts for a simple reason. There's chemical hooks in heroin that their bodies would start to desperately physically crave, right? This is why in English often we call people who are addicted, we say they're hooked, right? So there's something in the drug that their body starts to want more and more of, and that's what addiction is. The tremendous physical hunger for the drug after you've been exposed to it. The first thing that alerted me to the fact there's something not quite right about this story is when it was explained to me by lots of medical experts. In Britain, where I'm from, if I step out into the road after I talk to you and I get hit by a truck, and I break my hip, I'll be taken to hospital, and I'll be given a lot of a drug called diamorphine. Diamorphine is heroin. It's much better heroin than I could ever buy on the streets because it's medically pure heroin. Lots of people in British hospitals are given diamorphine. If any of you have a British grandmother who's had a hip replacement operation, your grandmother's taken a lot of heroin. If what we think is right, that addiction is caused primarily or entirely by exposure to the drug, what should be happening to all these people in British hospitals who are being given heroin. Some of them should be leaving hospital with an addiction problem. They should be trying to buy heroin on the streets. This has been studied very carefully. It never happens. And I remember when I learned that, just thinking, well, that can't be right. How can it be that you have someone in a hospital bed who's been given lots of really strong, potent heroin? They don't become addicted. And then you've got someone in the alleyway outside taking actually a weaker form of the drug, and they do become addicted. How could that be? I didn't understand it. And I only began to understand it when I went to Vancouver. I got to know an incredible man named Professor Bruce Alexander, who did an experiment that's transformed how we think about what addiction is and should transform our drug policies. So Professor Alexander explained to me this story we have in our heads that addiction is caused primarily or entirely by the chemical hooks comes from a series of experiments that were done earlier in the 20th century. They're really simple experiments. You guys can try them at home if you're feeling a little bit sadistic. You take a rat, you put it in a cage, and you give it 2 water bottles. One is just water, and the other is water laced with heroin or cocaine. If you do that, the rat will try both. It will almost always prefer the drugged water and almost always kill itself quite quickly. So there you go, right? That's our story. The rat is exposed to the drug, it wants more and more of it, it kills itself. But in the 1970s, Professor Alexander came along and said, well, hang on a minute. We're putting this rat alone in an empty cage. It's got nothing to do and nothing that makes life meaningful for rats. All it's got is the drugs, right? What would happen, he said, if we did this differently? So he built a cage that he called Rat Park, which is basically heaven for rats. They've got loads of friends, they've got loads of cheese, they've got loads of coloured balls, they can have loads of sex. Anything a rat wants in life is there in Rat Park. And they've got both the water bottles, the normal water and the drugged water. And of course, they try both. They don't know what's in them. This is the fascinating thing. In Rat Park, they don't like the drugged water. They hardly ever use it. None of them use it compulsively. None of them overdose. So you go from almost 100% compulsive use and overdose when when their needs are not met, to no compulsive use and overdose when they have the things that make life worth living. There's lots of human examples of this that I'm sure we'll discuss. But what this tells us is the opposite of addiction is not sobriety. The opposite of addiction is connection. That the core of addiction is about not wanting to be present in your life because your life is too painful a place to be. Now, once you understand addiction in this deeper way, you can see why one of the theories behind the war on drugs is such a disaster. So the war on drugs is based on the idea that people party too hard, they use drugs, and they need to be punished in order to give them an incentive to stop, right? But once you understand that actually you've got non-problematic drug use, which is the vast majority of drug use, right? We know that. If you go into a bar tonight, you'll look around you and you'll see the vast majority of people having a drink are just doing it to unwind or have a good time. And there'll be a small minority who have an alcohol addiction problem who need help. Actually, almost all drugs are like this. In fact, all drugs, the majority of people who use them are not addicted. I can come to the science about that if you want. But also, crucially, the ones who are addicted, what's going on there is that they're in pain and they're trying to anesthetize their pain. And once you understand that, you can see why what we do is such a disaster. And I saw this when I was in Reykjavik. If you inflict more pain on people in an attempt to stop their addiction, in fact, what you do is make their addiction worse. And one of the reasons I think it's so important for you to fight for this is we are talking about the most vulnerable people in our society, in your society, in my society, in any society, are people with addiction problems. The addiction is a signal that something's gone wrong for them as individuals and in the society. And we need to not wage war on the signal, but listen to the signal and meet the underlying need. I remember when I interviewed Ruth Dreyfus, the first female president of Switzerland, who led her country to completely transform their drug policies. And I said to her, what would you say to political people, political leaders in other parts of the world? She said, I would say to them, you are responsible for all your citizens, but you are most responsible for your weakest and most vulnerable citizens. They are the ones who most need your attention, your intellect, and real solutions. So I want to give an example of a country. I can talk about Switzerland if you like, and Ruth is just incredible. But I'll give an example of a country that directly built its drug policies on the lessons that come from Rat Park, that Bruce Alexander experiment. So in the year 2000, Portugal had one of the worst drug problems in the whole world. 1% of the population was addicted to heroin, which is mind-blowing. And every year they tried the war on drugs approach more and more. They arrested more people, they shamed more people, they put more people on trial, they gave more people criminal records. And every year the problem got worse. Until finally one day, the Prime Minister and the leader of the opposition got together and they said, look, we can't go on like this. What are we going to do? So they decided to do something really radical, something nobody had done in 70 years since the global system of prohibition of drugs began. They said, should we ask some scientists what we should do? So they set up a panel of scientists and doctors led by an amazing man I got to know called Dr. João Goulão. And they said to Dr. Goulão he'd set up the first drug treatment center in Portugal after the end of the dictatorship they'd had, the sort of fascistic dictatorship in 1974. And they said to João, go away, look at all the evidence. You and the panel, it was a panel of scientists, doctors, and social workers, and one judge. Figure out what would genuinely solve this problem. And we've agreed in advance we'll do whatever you recommend. So the idea was to just take it out of politics because the crisis was so big. So they go away, they look at all the evidence, including Rat Park, and they came back and they said, okay, here's what we're going to do. We're going to decriminalize all drugs, from cannabis to crack, everything. But, and this is the crucial next step, we're going to take all the money we currently spend on screwing people's lives up, sending the police to chase them around, harass them, put them in prison, and we're going to spend all that money instead on turning their lives around. And interestingly, it mostly wasn't what we think of drug treatment in Britain, think of as drug treatment in Britain and the United States. So they have some residential rehab, there's real value in that. But most of what they did was a program of reconnection for people with addiction problems. They say to people, so let's say you used to be a mechanic and you developed an addiction problem. They'll go to a garage and they'll say, if you employ this guy for a year, we'll pay half his wages. They set up a program of small business loans for people with addiction problems so they could set up and run businesses about things they care about with support. The goal was to say to everyone with an addiction problem in Portugal, we love you, we value you, we're on your side, we want you back. And by the time I went to Portugal, it was 13 years since this experiment had begun, and the results were in. According to the best study of this by the British Journal of Criminology, Portugal went from having one of the worst drug problems in the entire European Union to being the very bottom of the European League tables. Addiction problems more than halved, overdose deaths fell by 80%, HIV transmission among people with addiction problems fell even more. And one of the reasons you know it works so well is that almost nobody in Portugal wants to go back. I went and interviewed João Figueira, who was the top drug cop in Portugal at the time of the decriminalization. And he said what lots of people totally understandably say when they hear about, the idea of decriminalizing all drugs. He said, this is madness. We'll have an explosion in drug use. We'll have loads of kids using drugs. We can't possibly do this. And he said to me, everything I said would happen didn't happen. And everything the other side said would happen did. And he talked about how he felt really ashamed. He'd spent so many years chasing people around, ruining their lives, when he could have been helping them turn their lives around. And this is something I saw all over the world where drug reform has happened, from Canada to Uruguay to Switzerland. When people propose it, it is unbelievably controversial, and people regard it as insane. Then it happens, and things get dramatically better. It's not a silver bullet. They still have problems in Portugal and Switzerland and Canada and Uruguay, but things get so much dramatically better that there very rapidly becomes a new consensus around the changed policies. And in that new reality, far fewer people die. Because what I can tell you, and I saw this on the ground in Iceland when I was there, going out with, I'm sorry, I can't say Icelandic words, snarotin, I think they say it. who are doing incredible work at Harm Reduction Group on the ground. There are people who are dying in Iceland who in Portugal would live. And they are people who are in profound pain and profound suffering. There are lots of people in Iceland who have addiction problems at the moment, who, if they were given the right help, could turn their lives around and would be having much, much better lives. And you are a party I really admire who stand up for the people who are neglected and abused by the rest of the society. Addicted people are neglected and abused across the board. They are sending us a signal. Their addiction, whether they are rich or poor, their signal is that something has gone wrong in the society. And this is true, I say we, because of course this is true in Britain as well. We've created societies where significant numbers of people at the moment cannot bear to be present. Some of them will become depressed. Some of them will become anxious. Some of them will deal with that depression and anxiety by trying to anesthetize themselves with drugs. So you have two related issues here. You have addicted people, people with addiction problems who deserve love, compassion, and support. And everywhere that has built their drug policies on shame and punishment has growing addiction problems. Look at the United States. You don't need to tell me about you don't need me to tell you about the horror show there. And everywhere that has built drug policies based on love and compassion has significant improvements, reducing addiction. So there's the question of addiction, where these are deeply vulnerable people who need our love and support. Then there's the question of ordinary drug use. And in a funny way, it's actually harder to make the case for their freedom than it is to make the case for compassion for addicted people. But it's really important to do both. Once you understand that addiction is not about exposure to the drug and the drug taking you over, you can understand another basic reality about drug use, which is as I mentioned before, the vast majority of people who use drugs aren't addicted and will never be addicted and are not even taking the risk of addiction. Vast majority of people who smoke cannabis or a range of other drugs, use ecstasy, they're not risking addiction. Actually, if your life is good, if you have meaning and connection, you can express the natural human desire to be intoxicated in all sorts of ways and it won't harm you. It's much safer to do it in a context of decriminalization or legalization than in a context of harsh prohibition. We can talk about why if you want. So we've got a choice. At the moment, your country is spending a lot of its tax money, A, senselessly punishing people who are just having a good time using drugs, and B, making people's addiction problems worse by cruelly punishing them. There is an alternative. It works incredibly well. I've seen it work well in every country that has adopted it. The best scientific evidence is overwhelming on this. Countries that move towards more compassionate policies see massive improvements in every outcome of drug-related problems, all of them. You can choose that. You can fight for that. One thing that was striking to me in Iceland is not that many people, because thanks to Haldora, I went and spoke before a committee in your parliament, which was a fascinating experience. There aren't that many people who defend the status quo. Mm-hmm. What they do is they say the alternative is even worse, right? So they won't go, who's going to say, well, we've got these great outcomes in Iceland, right? And when it comes to drug policy, you don't need me to tell you that's absurd, right? But what they say is, they either create a ludicrous caricature of the alternative that people like us want to give, cocaine to 6-year-olds or something, which is preposterous and the opposite. And actually, interesting to note, after they decriminalized all drugs, children's drug use went down in Portugal. We can talk about why, if you want. If you want to protect your children, actually, you really want to get them out of the hands of armed criminal gangs and into the hands of, more responsible people. We need to I think it's two things we need to do. Firstly, undo, and Haldora's do, and Snaratin and all sorts of people in Iceland do incredible work on this. We need to undo the myths around drugs and drug use. We need to undo the stigma among people with addiction problems. If any of us had been through what they've been through, we would find drugs much more appealing and compulsive drug use much more appealing. And then we need to explain what the alternatives mean in practice and what has happened in the places where those alternatives were chosen. And I just think you're in an amazing position to do that. And I think Iceland is really right. And one of the things that's so important is this is really important for people in Iceland, for the most vulnerable people in Iceland. it also has a really important global ripple effect. The way the global drug war works, any break in the chain, any country that says, we're not going to do this anymore, it's crazy, it's destructive, it's harmful, it fails in every goal it sets out and makes the problem worse, inspires people in other places. And I really think so many people look up to Iceland as a really admirable society for all sorts of reasons. This is a way you can inspire so many people all over the world. So I really hope that you guys will continue to be part of this fight. We'll put it at the center of your election fight and the negotiations that follow. And I'm on your side. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Johann, for that. It's actually, I watched your TED Talk a while back, and it was really an eye-opener for me, this idea that the opposite of addiction is not sobriety, but connection. And it opened up just the opportunity for a whole new narrative and kind of understanding. Because often if you have a feeling for something, it doesn't mean that it's often just difficult to put words to that feeling. And you're such an amazing storyteller, Johann, and you're using your storytelling skill to change the world. And I really believe that these stories that you tell, they are changing the world and having that effect. And I'd just like to thank you for that. I think it's amazing.
So struck by you and all the people in the Pirate Party who I met. There's not many politicians who are brave on this issue. And you're so brave on this, and you're motivated by absolutely the right thing, which is love and compassion for people. So, right back at you.
Thank you. So I'd like to ask you a few questions. What struck me most when I started reading your book, Chasing the Scream, and I'm reading it in Icelandic.
How do you say this? I'm going to try to say this. It's incomprehensible.
Að hund elta ópið.
Oh, exciting.
So what really struck me is this Hari Anslinger character and the influence that he had over the world. And I have to say, when I started reading the book, and especially, the stories in the beginning, I was so angry. I almost wanted to throw the book out the window. I was so angry. and I just sad at how these people's lives have been influenced and how the entire world has been influenced by this one kind of crazy man, really. And but obviously the way that you describe his character and everything, it makes sense. You also have a kind of sympathy for this character, Hari Anslinger, and for what he stood for. But at the same time, I wanted to kind of ask you, obviously he was using this state of fear. There was a lot of fear at this time, and he made use of this to put out a lot of just propaganda and lies about drugs and about drug users. And it worked to the effect that the entire world went along with it for a really long time, and we're still doing it. And my question is to you, how do we prevent this? Is our society any better today? Are we still vulnerable to these strong types who come out and have this huge effect on this policy for the entire world? What is the lesson to be learned from this? How do we prevent this from happening with other subjects?
Yeah, so for people who don't know, Hari Anslinger is probably the most influential person who no one's ever heard of. Mm-hmm. He was a government bureaucrat who took over the Department of Prohibition in the United States just when alcohol prohibition was ending. So he's got this big government department with really nothing, this is soon going to have nothing to do. And he invented the modern war on drugs. He, in fact, is the first person to ever use the phrase war on drugs, way ahead of Richard Nixon or anyone else. And he really built the modern war on drugs in the United States initially, and then he spread it across the world around two groups he intensely hated. The first group was Black people. He was extraordinarily racist, even by the standards of the time. And the second group was people with addiction problems. I tell the story and open the book with the story of how he stalked and killed Billie Holiday, and which was made into a recent film called The United States versus Billie Holiday, which I checked you can watch in Iceland. But and it's really interesting, I think relevant to Iceland in all sorts of ways. So Hari Anslinger builds this war, exactly as you say, by creating all sorts of myths and lies that still persist, and spreading all sorts of myths and lies about drugs, about drug users, about people with addiction problems. But also he then imposes this policy on the rest of the world. So most countries did not adopt the global war on drugs until the Second World War was over. They resisted it. The US, Anslinger tried to make them do it before then, and they just said no. And then when the war was over, the world was in ruins. The United States was by far the most powerful country in the world. Much of the world was in ruins. And he used American diplomatic and basically aid and access to their trade routes to force everywhere to do it. There's an incredible quote, which I think could be the motto for the entire war on drugs at the at the new United Nations after the war. The representative for Thailand said, well, we don't want to have a war on drugs. It doesn't work in your country. We don't want to do it. And Anslinger was forcing them. And Harry Anslinger said, I've made up my mind. Don't try to confuse me with the facts. And I feel like that's the perfect logo for the global drug war. But this is really important, I think, because in every country, including in Iceland, huge numbers of people have broken the drug laws. And you could not possibly criminally punish everyone who has broken the drug laws in Iceland. It would be impossible, right? So everywhere where the drug laws are, where the war on drugs and global prohibition are enforced, what happens is those laws are used to crack down on the kind of people that the state wants and society want to crack down on anyway. So in the United States, that was obviously Black people, Latinos, Chinese Americans, but countries where, in different countries, in Brazil, I saw it being used against Blacker citizens. In Switzerland, it's used against poor people. I mean, it ranges prior to the change of policy in Switzerland. So you see that in Iceland. I remember going out with your harm reduction teams. And of course, the people who are being penalized and punished are the people the society wants to wash its hands of anyway, right? So these are always laws that will be enforced against despised and repressed groups, right? They're an additional tool that is given to repress minorities that the state wants to repress anyway. And it will always be that way because just the law breaking is so widespread that how could it be any other way?
Thank you, Johann. Another question would be this story that you always tell, which I found also about Rat Park, which is, I find to be like one of the key points because it comes into this idea of what is addiction and the definition of addiction and how we've been thinking about it all wrong. And my question is maybe, how do we build our societies more like Rat Park? Like how do we make lives meaningful? Because this has to be, at the end of the day, in my mind, this has to be the key to really to really making sure that less people become addicts, is to make people's lives more meaningful and better meet people's needs. Do you have any ideas on that, how we could do that?
You're so right, because I think you've gone to the absolute heart of it, which is to see that addiction is a symptom, right, of something going wrong in the wider cultures. There's really interesting people called Professor Anne Case and Professor Angus Dayton who've done really important work on this. So they looked at in the United States, at the moment, the US is having a horrific addiction crisis. If you look just at opioids alone, since the year 2000, the equivalent of the entire population of Miami has died of overdoses. I mean, it's just a staggering rate of death. And obviously, I've spent a lot of time in the places where this is happening. And if you look at it, so they use the phrase deaths of despair. Those addiction overdose deaths are happening in exactly the same places where suicide deaths that are not using drugs are happening, where depression is highest, so all those things match on graphs, right? Depression, suicide, addiction, they're all in the same places. Interestingly, also support for Trump, which I think is worth thinking about. These are all indicators of despair. I mean, I'd rather you became addicted to heroin than voted for Trump, but you get my point, right? Sorry, the slightly glib point, but you know what I mean. But so wherever addiction, and you see this historically, right? In Britain, in the 18th century, huge numbers of people are driven out of the countryside where they had secure communities into disgusting urban slums. And there's a huge outbreak of addiction. It's called the gin craze. And at the time, what people said is, look at this evil drug gin, look at how it destroys people. Well, we know that's not the case. I've got gin in my kitchen behind me. I'm not drinking it all day, right? There's, why was there an explosion in addiction then? Because there was an explosion in social despair. And whenever a factory closes in the United States, in a town, the rate of opioid addiction doubles over the next 5 years. So we can see, and this is part of a much bigger crisis, as you know, Haldora, and I've written a lot about this in my other book, Lost Connections. Everyone has natural physical needs, obviously. You need food, you need water, you need shelter, you need clean air. But also, everyone has natural psychological needs. You need to feel you belong. You need to feel your life has meaning and purpose. You need to feel that people see you and value you. You need to feel you've got a future that makes sense. And we've built a culture that is good at many things. There are lots of things that are radically better than in the past. I'm just reading a Haldor Laxness novel, and I'm not naive about how much better many things are in Iceland than they were in the past. But when it comes to some of these core psychological needs, we have been becoming less and less good at meeting them. We're creating a culture that creates profound alienation and atomization. And I think you're totally right that there's two aspects to this, right? There's drug policy. So at the moment, we have a drug policy that takes people who are distressed, distresses them more, screws them up more, makes the problem worse. There's a lot you can do with drug policy. Portugal showed that. It's not as much, the decriminalization is important, stopping harming people is important, but the really crucial part of the Portugal thing, that the Portuguese change, for me, was not that, although crucial though it was actually the shift in what they did with the money they used to use in screwing people's lives up, they used to actually help people and make their lives better. But you're right, this goes way beyond drug policy, right? This is why it's so important to me that a party with an agenda like yours is articulating this. Because look, there are plenty of decent right-wing people in the world who wouldn't agree with us on changing the society, but nonetheless want to decriminalize drugs. And credit to them, they're helping. But I think to really deal with the problem, you have to marry the change in drug policy with a much more extensive, I would argue, social and spiritual transformation of the society, where we're much more connected to each other. We have much more meaningful values. We have more meaningful purpose. I mean, another thing I know you care deeply about as a party and you personally, we are engaged in the destruction of the biosphere, right? We should be anxious. We should feel down. We're destroying we should then use that anxiety and the feelings of concern we have to fuel social change. So we should, instead of stigmatizing the signal of distress, we should be listening to the signals of distress and using that distress as a fuel for actual programs of hope and change.
Those are actually amazing last words. But I am going to ask a question. And that was, it's a simple one, although I don't like to confuse these two issues, but I think it's part of the larger picture. And that is, in your work and your books that you've written and all of your research that you've done, in your opinion, should we be legalizing all drugs?
Yes, but it's very important to understand what that does and doesn't mean. So I don't know the rules in Iceland, but in Britain, I legally could own a dog, a monkey, and a lion, but the rules are completely different. So for a dog, I can just go into a shop and buy one. For a monkey, I need a license. And for a lion, they come and inspect my house and would say no in my house because I have a small flat in London, right? So they're all legal, but they're legal in different ways. So I would argue we do need to move towards a model of legalization. First, it's important to say decriminalization on its own is a huge advance and absolutely worth fighting for. And it gets us a long way there. But I would argue we need to move towards legalization for a few reasons. For me, you can tell addiction is very close to my heart. But actually, the biggest moral issue around drug policy is not addiction. The biggest moral issue is the violence caused by prohibition. So when you ban drugs, they don't cease to exist. You will have all noticed. They're transferred from legal businesses to armed criminal gangs. And that causes a huge amount of violence. If you want to understand why, you can do a little experiment. Go into your nearest shop that sells alcohol and try to steal a bottle of vodka. If the shop catches you, they'll call the police. the police will come and arrest you. So that shop doesn't need to be violent. They don't need to be intimidating. They've got the power of the law to uphold their property rights. Okay, now go and try to steal a bag of cannabis or a bag of cocaine. I'm sure there's someone who sells it near you. If that guy catches you, or woman, obviously he can't call the police. The police would come and arrest him. He has to fight you. Now, he doesn't want to be having a fight every day, so he has to establish a reputation for being a badass who no one would be so stupid as to try to steal his drugs from, right? Or her drugs from. So the war on drugs creates a war for drugs, right? When you have no recourse to the law to protect your property, your drugs, you have to establish your right to that property through violence. Now, that's bad enough on the streets of Reykjavik where you have, violence sometimes. Places I went to like northern Mexico, Colombia, and parts of Vietnam, you're talking about staggering amounts of death. I mean, it's hard to get exact figures, but if you added up all the deaths in Latin America from this war for drugs, it's more than the number of people who've died in the war in Syria, right? And I don't know what we can do about the war in Syria, apart from obviously give refuge to the people fleeing. But the war for drugs, we can end it, right? And if you want to know how quickly we can end it, ask yourself, where are the violent alcohol dealers? Does the head of Heineken go and shoot the head of Smirnoff in the face? No, exactly that happened under alcohol prohibition. Rival drug alcohol gangs killing each other. And it ended literally the day that alcohol was legalized again in the United States. We all know who Al Capone was. None of you know the name of the head of Heineken, right? Unless you're related to him. So to me, the most important thing is, and it's important to explain the difference between decriminalization and legalization. So decriminalization is where you stop punishing users and people with addiction problems for having and using their drugs. But they still have to go to armed criminal gangs to get their drug, right? So what you do and legalization is where you open up some legal route for them to get their drug. Important to stress again, that means different things for different drugs. So cannabis, I would legalize like alcohol. You have to go to a licensed store. You have to be over 21. You can only buy up to a certain potency, all of those things. Heroin, I do not believe you should legalize like that. I don't think you should be able to buy heroin in a store. In Switzerland, under Ruth Dreyfus, they legalized heroin in a very different way. If you have an addiction problem, you're referred to a heroin clinic. I went to the one in Geneva. You go and use your drug there. They monitor you to make sure you don't overdose. And then you leave to go to your job because they give you loads of help to get work and support. And if you want to know, anyone want to guess, this is 17 years since they legalized heroin in Switzerland. Anyone want to guess watching? Just say it out loud in front of your screen. How many people have died of heroin overdoses on legal heroin in Switzerland in all those years? The answer is 0. None. And in the illegal market, it's fallen and fallen every year because who wants to buy shitty street heroin when you can get it from much better stuff from the government where you also give you help? So often you hear people here go, oh, I think we should legalize heroin. They think we're saying, oh my God, you think there should be an aisle in my local pharmacy selling heroin? No, that's not what I mean. So I think we need to move to we need to experiment with moving towards legal regulated routes, which will mean different things for different drugs. And there are some where we just don't know what the legal route would be yet. Maybe at music festivals, there should be legal bars where you could buy ecstasy. We can try all sorts of different options. What we've had is 100 years of trying only one option. And it's been a disaster by every possible metric. And the one thing we really know about the war on drugs, the thing you can say in defense of the American war on drugs, is they have really tried. They've done it for 100 years. They've imprisoned millions of their own citizens. They've killed hundreds of thousands of their own citizens. They've destroyed entire countries like Colombia and El Salvador. And at the end of all that, they've spent, by the way, they've spent $1 trillion. And at the end of all that, they can't even keep drugs out of their prisons where they pay people to walk around the perimeter the whole time, right? That will never work. By every standard, it has, everywhere that's ever tried it, it has failed. There are alternatives. We can choose them. At some point, I would urge Iceland to stop imitating the places that have failed, like Sweden and the United States, and start imitating the places that have succeeded, like Portugal and Switzerland.
Also great
Or closing statement, more like, yeah.
For it, so this is not me. If you want to know more about this, you can read my book in Icelandic, and I still can't say it, but yeah. Okay, yes. Yeah, so
it's a great book. It's a great book, Johann. Thank you. And I really look forward to, because I understand that you're writing a book now.
Just finishing it.
Yeah. So I really look forward to that book. And also you wrote a book about depression before, which I've still to read. It's on my reading list. So.
Well, I'm going to hang up now and discuss. How dare you? You both me depressed. And I would say if I was Icelandic, I would vote for you, and I would vote for the pirate party. So, and you can check. I don't say that to the other parties in Iceland.
Thank you very much, Johann. Thank you for this.
Thank you so much. Hooray! Thank you.